Welcome to the Leadership Zone. Today we have Shane Cradock to talk to us about leadership. Now, Shane has published some books which are very interesting. He also works as a coach and a leadership specialist. And we found that there was some crossover, so I thought it'd be really good for us to have a conversation. But as usual, because I usually botch people's introductions, I've asked Shane to introduce himself. And before we came on, Shane said, "Oh, that's awful. That's worse if you introduce me." But Shane still has to introduce himself. So Shane, on the spot, would you just let listeners know a little bit about you and your work, and then we'll kick off from there?
Sure. Thanks, Sheila. I'm based in Wicklow in Ireland. I work with ambitious leaders, mostly in Ireland, but also internationally. And I work with leaders who are, I suppose, interested in thriving, is what I would normally say. And what that means to me is they are looking to create meaningful success in their leadership, their work and life, but also to get that insight as well, to enjoy life, to have a lot of meaning, a lot of purpose. I'm
Okay.
doing it over 25 years, and which I always hate saying out loud. That's the bit I hate the most.
It's
That
so,
long. Yeah.
it's so funny, isn't it? Because it really does give us away. In terms of the work you're doing, we'll talk a little bit about how you got there, but I'm curious about what part of the work kind of drew you to it, or what feels like it's really important to you in this work that you're doing.
I think it's really important in the world that we're in. Like every year that goes by, I think, no, people are going to get it, the value of this. And I find on some level that's true, but on another level it's not. We're in a world, I don't need to describe it to your listeners. There's a lot of disruptions, a lot of volatility, there's a lot of uncertainty that creates for a lot of people anxiety and questions and things like that. And I just find more and more that the key to really great leadership really has to start inside you because it's about managing yourself, your inner world, to keep a cool head under pressure and in that uncertainty has never probably more important. It also relates into things like you talk about inclusivity, because we need that diversity of perspective and input more important than ever. And so having an awareness of your inner world and understanding how to leverage that, not just for yourself, but with the people around you in your teams, your organizations, but actually also with your families, your kids, your partners, really, really important. And I'm going to say that, look, certainly over the next decade, the single most important thing from my perspective with anybody looking to really advance their career as a leader is the inner world of the leader.
I think that's really important. You mentioned family and friends. I kind of joke, but it's not a joke. Whenever I've worked with clients, and if we're talking about the unintended positive consequences that kind of come up, clients say things to me like, my wife, my partner, my kids, the relationship's better. And that might not be what we actually worked on as in the topic, but the same things that help them be more effective in work and in their leadership has
Mm,
resulted in more positive relationships and experiences. So I think we're quite aligned in that understanding that
mm,
that internal world doesn't just happen at work or express things at work, it expresses things across kind of different realms. In terms
100%.
of the importance of that inner world for people, will you say a little bit about why you think it's important and how you kind of define it?
Well, why do I think it's important? Well, think about these words: confidence, clarity, creativity, communication, collaboration, resilience. They're all related to what's going on inside you. And the better you are inside you, what seems to be true to me is that those things are innate within me and within all of us. And the better I am inside me, the better opportunity I give for those things to come out naturally. So all of those things I've mentioned, by the way, I think from what I see working with CEOs, most of my clients are CEOs or C-suite executives or entrepreneurs. And, I work very closely with really good, smart, hardworking people who are in the trenches, people who get hit metaphorically in the face all the
Mm.
time or kicked hard sometimes, as a leader. Being a leader is not easy, any context really at the moment. And so all of those words I said, if you can increase even just a little bit, surely that's going to ripple into your work. And also, as you just said there, to your family and friends. And just going back to what you said about that, like for me, it used to be like I remember my dad coming home. He spent most of his life working with Guinness, Sheila, and
Mm.
I have memories of him coming on when I was a child, and he'd walk in the front door, and he'd first thing he'd do every time, first thing he'd walk in the front door, he'd walk to where he put his bag on the ground, and then he'd walk across to where the phone was, very close to the door, the old landlines connected to the
Mm.
wall, and he'd take the phone off the receiver and he'd put it to the side, and that was his way of saying, they can't get me. My personal time starts now. Now, clearly, that's some of your listeners might even know what I'm talking about, right? But some will. But now that's kind of gone. So it used to be work life, personal life. Now it's just one life. And so you've got one inner world that affects your one life. Because as you said, well, you're working on something over here. Well, effectively, you're working on that person's inner world, really. And
Mm.
so if they're better and they feel more confident, more in control, well, then everything gets better. And that's the beauty of it, is that I think it's the smallest cog perhaps that's often hidden, which is inside you.
Hmm.
And it's very personal to you because we all have a different inner world, yet some of those inner elements are the same. For example, we all have a mind, apparently. We all think, we all have an inner voice. That inner voice changes at times with our inner climate. Sometimes
Hmm.
it's friendly to us, sometimes it's harsh, sometimes it's supportive, sometimes it's not. But as I say to my clients, look, once you start to understand the variables of your inner world and the fact that most importantly, there's an observer in there, there's an awareness in there, like you're aware of your inner voice. That might sound, in a previous time, that might sound very spiritual, perhaps,
Mm.
and it is. But I think it's very practical. And in today's world, though, the most important thing is that it's an element of an emotionally aware, emotionally intelligent leader has an understanding of how those different variables inside themselves combine to let them step up or perhaps shut them down. And once you see it in yourself, it's much easier to help other people to navigate the same terrain. I think what you were saying earlier on about how did I get into it, like a lot of things maybe with people with life, it wasn't a straight line, but I got through it. I got into this area out of a difficult circumstance I found myself as I suppose, a young 24-year-old, where I ended up kind of in a very kind of dark place. And, without getting into necessarily too much detail around it, the gift of that time was I was given the opportunity, I guess, to work on myself. Let's just say it like that. At the time, I had qualified actually as a biochemical engineer, nothing to do with what I'm doing now.
Mm.
But because, again, and I'm sure like you and other people listening to this, you can make all sorts of plans, but sometimes life then has its own little way. It's
Mm.
got its own river for you, and you kind of go, oh. And so a whole new world opened up. And it was really more out of my own curiosity for my own survival first. And
Mm.
then I realized that what I was learning was really helpful. And then I realized, oh, I can achieve things.
Mm.
I can become better. In time, I learned also that, with some variations, I could enjoy more because
Mm.
achievement didn't necessarily guarantee enjoyment, which was
Mm.
interesting to me.
Mm.
And so a lot of my time now I spend with leaders working on what I would call sustainable high performance, which sounds a bit fancy, but really it's in simple terms, it's just helping the person to become more human in a meaningful way, right? So it's not just about achievement and achieving goals, but to doing it in a way that's ethical, that's also authentic,
Mm.
to use your word, inclusive as well.
Mm.
I'm big into diversity of thinking, by the way, but insofar as that, I encourage all of my clients. I just think it's one of the key skills for a leader for the coming time. For me, though, diversity of thinking is really about diversity of thinking, diversity of perspective. It's so
Mm.
important that to understand as a leader that you're not the only one who has a perspective. You're never always right. And in today's world, you absolutely cannot know everything.
Mm. Mm. I think that's really interesting because that's been a shift, I think, that you can kind of see through the research and stuff over kind of maybe 25 years, where there was a time where being the leader was because you knew everything inside out. And
Yeah,
now with the pace of things, with how quickly people can access information, retain information, do things, it's about how you help other people to perform. And even though that's what it might have always meant in theory, in practice, usually the leaders did have all the answers. Like
yeah,
historically, there was some kind of knowledge-based leadership, whereas now we're much more leaning towards actually your job is to get the right people making the right decisions at the right times, which sometimes mean it's not the decision you yourself would prefer. And I think that also speaks to some of the pace that leadership is facing now. There's a pace that it didn't face because you weren't dealing with globalization, you weren't dealing with social media to the same extent. Your example of the phone is really key. I spend a lot of time when I work with leaders talking about, like, do you know when to use your phone and when not to? And that's usually because they're telling me there's a work-life balance issue, but then they're telling me that at 1 a.m. they replied to an email. I'm like, how did you know there was an email at 1 a.m.? There's this kind of like separation that's happened a little bit from realizing that people might want to keep access, but you're still responsible for deciding the access you give to people. And I think that that's a really important part of taking care of the inner part, because otherwise you just become a vessel for others. You just keep doing rather than actually having time to be with yourself. And that might be watching the crap on TV that you watch. That might be watching a match. It doesn't have to be isolation or being alone. It's just making sure that you have some time to recoup, I think.
yeah,
And that's becoming harder with phones. So I think your example of the phone is really key at the moment, because I'm hearing more and more people talk about how distracting the phone is for them in work. I'm curious because if there is some kind of evidence around it, but there's also some conversations around it at the moment. There's a lot of emphasis gone into lots of different types of supports for people based on the barriers they face based on their identity. So, we have a lot of supports around some issues women might face as leaders in the workplace. There's lots of supports about people with different identities. one of the things that is only starting to peek through, I think, in inclusion work, and one of the things that I've been quite invested in for quite a long time has been men and men's ability to process because of process emotion, process thinking, because of the pressures externally on them. And I suppose one of the things I found when I work with male leaders is that for some of them, they had a moment that introduced them to something where they worked on themselves, and for others they didn't. They got to where they are and they're stuck. But actually, a big part of their experience is because they don't know it's okay to feel what they're feeling. They don't might not even know what they're feeling. They might not feel supported in their environment, so they are the supporter to everyone. And I'm wondering, because I believe that when we have different identities as the coach or the facilitator, it also brings out different things in people. And I'm wondering if you see that as something that's important in the process as well. If we talk about men's needs for a moment, what's your sense of that? Do you think there is a difference based on how men are taught to be in the world?
I suppose I think it's very important. I think, look, I can relate it to a lot of what you just said. I think without a doubt, one of the things, for example, when I'm working with a new client, I have a couple of kind of tests that I'd run them through, but one of them will be to get a sense of their emotional intelligence, emotional awareness, just so I can get a feel for where they're at in themselves.
Mhm.
Although most of the time, as you know from experience, when you're working so long with people, I kind of know within 60 seconds kind of where they're really at. You know what I mean? You can almost see it in their eyes, actually.
Mhm.
I find that eyes are literally the gateway to the soul. So I think one of the things that I focus on with a lot of my clients, I would say kind of in a way, maybe the 80-12-20 rule applies that, and I'm not saying it's exactly 20%, but
Mm.
probably, about that smaller percentage would be in the higher awareness category of emotion intelligence. And the majority have work to do. And I'm very clear with them that I'm saying to them that, look, this is one of the key skills for you as a leader for the future. And if you ignore this, you're kind of going to sabotage yourself and your organization. So I had a guy there a couple of months ago, Sheila, when I measured him on the scale that I have, it was at the lowest scale, lowest level of the scale.
Mm.
And I said it to him, and he said, "Look, I don't even know what it means.
Mm.
I just don't know what it means." And to your point, I mean, look, I'm an Irish man. I grew up in Ireland. I think when I'm dealing with Irish men, it's different to dealing with American men, without a doubt.
Yes, yes. There's a
And
big
there,
cultural
there,
difference, yeah.
there, there is a cultural difference. I mean, there's a big cultural difference. There's some more similarity, although it can be differences as well with, say, British men
Mhm.
or European men, but it's very stark with American and Irish. Irish men have got a lot of strengths, but I would say, look, there's the 80%, yes, there's work to be done in terms of, but I find once we start to talk about like that guy in particular, like I just gave him a very simple exercise. He said, where do I even start?
Mm.
And I said, tell you what, we're not going to overcomplicate this. I just want you to be aware that actually you are registering emotions. You've got some part of your conditioning telling you that that's not relevant. But I said it is relevant. And I said everybody else in the meeting with you is registering emotions and feelings.
Mhm.
That's all information. So I said, all I want you to do for the next couple of weeks is when you're in a meeting and you're listening to people give you words, I just want you to ask the question, what's the feeling behind the words?
Mhm.
And honestly, that one thing alone has switched on something inside him that was lying dormant. And it's given him information. He said to me, he says, I had a conversation with somebody in my team after one of those meetings saying, because I picked up the feeling was stress. And I just asked him a few questions and I realized, and he said, yeah, there is a lot of stress. Of course there is, as if he should know. But he said, having one of the most productive conversations he'd had with this guy probably in about 2 years because he saw something he hadn't seen before. So to your point, that information is key. I think like there's a learning curve in it. But what gives me hope is that someone like that, who was kind of on the zero side of it,
Mm.
starts to move up the learning curve and now values it. But there's a lot of work to be done. And by the way, just to flip it back on its head, one of the things that I've had to talk to some of my female clients about, especially leaders,
Mm.
is to not become like men.
Mm. Mm.
Because in some situations I've seen them start to almost shut down their emotional intelligence.
Mhm.
And
Mm.
that's what we need more of, is to bring that sense to balance up the equation almost between the yin
Mhm.
and the yang. The male energy has got some very good practical elements to it in terms of driving, ambition, taking risk, and that kind of stuff. But it's to kind of balance it up with the other, really, really important. So I don't know if I've answered your question exactly, but
I think that that's really interesting because the way that when I talk about anything that's, I put an identity next to like, and gender, I perceive it as a lack in society and not a lack in the person. So I believe that every person has the same capabilities within them, but they need to be nurtured. And I think
yeah,
what I have found is that when you're trying to develop something in someone who has been conditioned to avoid that, it's not just that they're conditioned to avoid it, they don't know that they even have the skill, but it
Yeah.
just lies. And I like your word dormant because I think that's been my experience when
Yeah.
I work with any identity that has some kind of systemic kind of limitation or expectation that they've been conditioned.
Yeah.
They often have the skill, they just don't know how to get to it. And your example is of the person at zero is really key. It's not that they don't have the skill set, it's not that they don't want to, it's not even that it doesn't make sense, it's that sometimes they don't know how where it belongs and what it looks like.
Exactly. Yeah. And it kind of goes back to my point there as well about, and like for me, by the way, if you'd asked me that, I don't know, 7 years ago, I'm not sure I would have given you the same answer.
Mm,
I might have gone, because for me, as you know, like in your work, like very often you're experimenting, you're trying almost to, okay, this, my thesis is this, let's test it. But definitely in the last few years, and that guy is a great example where I'm kind of going, wow, if he's helped to give him permission to look in this direction and
yes.
for him to experiment himself, and then for him to come back and say, actually, that was really helpful,
Hmm.
right? All of a sudden now it started to be integrated and he's expanding. So, and what that shows me is, again, a kind of an innateness,
Yes.
an innate quality that does seem to be there. That, to your point, you're using words I wouldn't necessarily always use, but I would agree with it in terms of like the system
Hmm.
that's there almost as kind of just put a cover over that element of that person. And now you're taking it away, saying, no, no, look over here, try that. And then this innateness starts to come out almost like a flower.
Hmm.
And what's interesting about that guy in particular, now we're talking about him, is that he had said to me, he said, you didn't say this, he said, but I started to do it at home as well.
Mm.
And my wife asked me recently, what are you doing differently?
Yeah. Oh,
And
that's
because
magic.
he was just more attentive at home, listening for the feeling as much
Hmm.
as for the words. And so he was more present. And
Hmm.
so she was like, what are you doing differently? And he's like, nothing. She said, well, no, you're doing something because you're more here,
Mm. Mm.
that's magic to my ears as well.
100%. I think that that's quite powerful. And I would actually also say from a different direction, some of the most genuinely emotionally intelligent leaders I've met are men. That I don't have an assumption that they aren't. In fact, I've met some really emotionally intelligent men. And one of the things I think can also happen is it can be deemed as a weakness. So not always, sometimes it's in the right environment and people love to see it coming. But I've also seen that it can be utilized against men the same way emotion can be utilized against women, that it's perceived that they aren't something enough. And whenever I hear the word enough, I know that we're in some kind of systemic barriers because everyone is just enough. And if we're talking behavior, we're just talking more or less behavior. But I think there's something, and I like the point about Irish men because I do work across like internationally, and there is differences based on cultural influences, and I would also say religious influences can have a big
Yeah,
difference, and then there's other differences like race and ethnicity, but there is a big cultural difference that I think when we look at the history of Ireland and we look at some of the things that men were taught were not okay, we see them walking around with this kind of like dormant areas. And then, like you said, in a funny way, I often say that in coaching, if you get someone who's had kind of systemic conditioning that has stopped them, they often progress much quicker because it's not a lack of having the thing, it's not knowing how to access it or use it. And so once they have that, you can see kind of like quite a quick upsurge in their effectiveness because it
yeah,
wasn't a lack of the thing, it was just not having a relationship with the thing. So they didn't know how to use it, especially
exactly.
when we talk about emotional intelligence. So I think it's important because I don't like doing the comparison of genders, but I do think it's important that there are barriers that men face when we ask them to step into leadership in this way that might not be what they've brought, but what they've inherited. And then you're kind of asking people sometimes to step outside of what they've deemed as good. And I think that that's important we acknowledge, especially in the inclusion where there's a lot of criticism of men. And while there's lots of things I think loads of us should be doing better, there's also impacts that this stuff has on everybody that isn't helpful, I would say. So I
Yeah,
like to kind of acknowledge that when we talk about working with people in their growth, because otherwise it lands it as the individual rather than actually the individual is using the skills they were taught to use. And if there's a
exactly.
bucket of them they weren't taught to use, then that's untapped potential. That's not a lack of caring. That's not a lack of effort. That's just
Exactly,
untapped
exactly,
potential.
exactly. No, no, and untapped potential is the best way. That's my experience. It is untapped potential. That's what excites me. And
Hmm.
especially when you're dealing with somebody who it's like that was the lowest score I ever had in that profile. But he almost moved the fastest when he started to see it. And what was interesting, and what this is my favorite thing is with very little training or coaching,
Mm.
which implies that it's kind of there. Do you know what I mean? So he's educating himself, letting something come out. But then something else that you mentioned there was about conditioning, and just to link it back in, like most people, most of us, like we don't realize the level with which we've been conditioned.
Mm.
To your point, maybe the country you grew up, whether you're a man or woman, whatever your identity is, the culture you're in, the era you grow up in, whether you grew up with the phone,
Mm.
the smartphone or the landline phone. But also then, this is what fascinates me, Sheila, I'm sure yourself as well, but like it's why I wrote that book, The Inner CEO, is that to me is like there's a level of conditioning in there that defines and tells me, well, who I think Shane is, and also who Shane isn't, and
Mhm.
what Shane can do and what Shane can't do. And what I've seen and loved in my own life is to basically challenge that conditioning
Mm.
and ideally to remove it, to unlearn it, so that my own innateness, whatever my pure element of my own expression is, both as a leader, as a person, as a father, as a husband, like they're all labels I can put on myself because of my roles. But to get to the essence of me, and to you point, what you said earlier on about the leaders of today, it's not so much about being the subject matter expert, as you said. It's really about helping the people in front of you, around you, untap their potential. But how can you do that if you don't have to understand how to do it on yourself? So once you see it on yourself and then you start to role model it, what's nice is A, it's easier to communicate it, it's easier to coach and facilitate people, but B also, or C, people pick up on it. So now you've got this energy of an inspired type of a leader, which isn't easy, but it's possible.
Mm.
That's the bit that gets me out of bed in the morning, wherever I'm working with. If they can it's kind of get people to realize, oh yeah, they're crazy enough to kind of go as well, yeah, I want to untap that potential too. It's not always easy. It's hard being a leader. It's hard being the one to step up. But I'm lucky that, like you, I get to work with smart people
Mhm.
who want to change. But to me, ultimately, no matter what you're saying or whatever I say, ultimately, I know the answer is inside me. It's not inside. If there's a fight here, I look inside myself first before anything
Mhm.
else. If there's a disagreement, I have to look inside myself first.
Mhm. I think that's really powerful because I think so much effort goes into leadership skills, as in doing, and leadership knowledge, as in knowing. And we know that, and I can definitely sense a difference. And I hear it every day when I'm working with people. When somebody can hold themselves and they have that internal relationship, they can hold a lot more externally, they can manage a lot more. The weaker that internal relationship with self is, the more we're likely to be distracted or pulled into or dysregulated by all of the other realities that are going on around us. And I think there's something about that inner work that you point to that's really important. If I want to be able to be effective, I need to have an internal world that I have a relationship with, rather than thinking that everything that happens externally is the truth or isn't the truth. I have to be able to internalize it and understand it. And I think that's quite powerful. I love that you mentioned the book, The Inner CEO. I'm only a couple of chapters in, but what I really, really love is actually you role model what you're talking about by opening up with your own story. And I think that's really important because we spend so much time, like I said, on knowing and doing in leadership, that we're actually missing the fact that if someone doesn't hold themselves, it's very hard for them to create credibility and trust, regardless of what they do and say, because we feel something when we're in relationship with people. We get a sense whether they are in relationship with themselves or not. And so I really love that the way the book is written role models exactly what you're talking about. It's not just you talking about it, you're actually demonstrating it. If I was going to say to leave listeners with one piece of advice, is there anything you'd say, this is really something I think you should consider as something to take on board?
Yeah, well, I mean, there's so many different things I could say, and there's so much out there about the mental side of things now. But here's something I'd say that maybe mightn't be in the mainstream yet. I'm very clear that the busy mind is the enemy of clarity, contentment, and more inspired leadership. A busy mind, not a negative mind. A negative mind isn't great, but a busy mind, going back to what you talked about, but the phone. I don't think the phone is the problem. I think the phone is kind of the easy person to blame or easy thing to
Mm.
blame. The issue is that we're addicted to having busy minds. That's what I would say. And so if somebody's looking to make a significant shift in their life and their leadership, I would say learn genuinely how to calm your mind while still being busy in your working life.
Mhm.
Because it's possible to be calmer inside while still active on the outside. So that to me is a very significant point, I think, right now.
I really love that. It reminds me of that saying, it's not the ocean that sinks the ship, it's that it gets inside the boat or the ship.
Very good.
So it's that
Yeah.
type of thinking. I really like that how we hold ourselves in the midst of it is so important. Well, thank you for joining us. Anybody who wants to follow up with you will have links below so they'll be able to click the link and connect with you directly. I really appreciate you coming on and you've given me some really good food for thought myself. So I really appreciate it. So thanks for
Great.
being a guest.
Really enjoyed it. Thank you, Sheila.
Take care.